What's going on, San Antonio Spurs fans? Today we have another special guest for some Pounding the Rock prospect talk. We've got Corey Tulaba from Hardwood Herald. If you haven't seen it, definitely go check it out. How are you doing today?
I am awesome, man. Thank you for inviting me on. Thanks for having me. Really excited to do this. Most of the podcast appearances I've been doing for the draft have been very like either Knicks or Bulls focused. So I'm excited to talk about literally any other team. And actually, the San Antonio Spurs were the first game that I ever went to live. It was David Robinson versus Shaq. So the Spurs always have a very near and dear piece of my heart. So very excited to be here.
Yeah, and thank you for coming on. I was really excited. I reached out to you, wasn't sure if I was going to heard back from you really quickly, and I knew this was going to be a really awesome opportunity, awesome video, and what a game to go to, a Shaq versus David Robinson game. That sounds pretty amazing. But today we're going to be talking about Kira Lewis, and for those of you at home who don't know who Kira Lewis is, he's a 19-year-old sophomore point guard out of Alabama University. He stands 6'3" with a 6'5" wingspan, and I recently read that he gained about 15 pounds of weight from when he ended his college season. So that puts him at about 180. So some pretty decent measurables for a point guard, and he's lightning quick, but we'll go right into these questions. So the first thing I want to ask you are, what are his greatest strengths heading into the NBA, and where do you think he's going to be most lethal in the league?
Well, like you said, his greatest strength is his speed. A lot of these prospects don't necessarily have an elite skill, but he's one of the prospects who does. His speed is elite. He's in that Kobe White, De'Aaron Fox tier of, just speed with the ball in his hands. And there's another player in this draft, RJ Hampton, who's kind of in that same tier as well, but Kira is a little bit more controlled in what he does. He's got a better handle on that speed. So, not only is he fast, but he's effectively fast. And I think that's an important distinction, when you're talking about fast athletic prospects. So, I think where you're going to see him thrive, especially early on as a player, is going to be in transition. He's a guy who is going to go get an outlet pass and he's going to be gone. Or even if he doesn't receive the outlet in the backcourt, he's going to be gone, kind of leaking out and get a ton of layups that way. So definitely that open court speed is going to be where you see him really thrive as a player very early on in his career.
I definitely agree with you there. And, I'm not giving a one-for-one comparison because I'm not a huge fan of those. I think sometimes, it's easy to get caught up and then fans think, well, that's who this guy is. But as a Spurs fan, I can't help but think of Tony Parker when I think of that blazing speed, but under control. And I'm sure Spurs fans would welcome somebody like that who is so quick. But we'll get more into some of the other aspects of his game. So we talked about his greatest strength, it being speed and how he's going to kill in transition. But what do you think are some areas of improvement that he really needs to work on as he heads into the NBA?
Well, I think with that speed, because he has it in the half court too, and one of the things that he's great at is getting into the paint, but you'd like to see him get his free throw attempts up a bit. It's not that he was bad at getting to the free throw line necessarily, but if you're looking at the point guard position, which is absolutely stacked in the NBA, and you're thinking, am I possibly getting a guy who could be in that upper echelon of point guard? He's going to have to, improve his free throw attempt rate. And maybe part of that is putting on the extra weight. And like you alluded to earlier, he has done that. When he gets drafted, he's going to be, I think, 10 pounds heavier than De'Aaron Fox was. And we've seen him turn into an excellent player in the league. So for me, I want to see Kira, kind of not avoid contact as much when he does get into the paint. I think if he is able to get to the free throw line, it's going to turn him just into an incredibly efficient scorer because he's a good scorer from basically every area of the court, and he's a good free throw shooter. So if he can get eventually, if he becomes a starting level player, and which I believe that he will be, if he can get those free throws up to, say 5.5, 6 a game at the NBA level, that turns him into, a new tier of what his potential could really, end up being.
Definitely. And we see a lot of players who are able to get to the line be these lethal scorers. And one of the things that a lot of the San Antonio Spurs current guards need to work on is not just getting to the line, but embracing contact. They tend to avoid contact. We've seen it with DeJounte. We've seen it with Lonnie, where they alter their shots. They go for really tough attempts, and it ends up just, being bricks. it leaves the door open for transition opportunities on the other end. Now they're lagging behind. So I'd love to see Kyra work on that as well, because I do think you're right, that would unlock another part of his game. And I think Kyra is kind of an overlooked prospect when we're thinking of the 2020 draft class. And I know it's perceived as a weaker class. I still think there are some really good players in this class. Maybe it's lacking some star power, but when we think of this class, we think of some of the point guards in here, right? We think of like LaMelo Ball, we think of Tyrese Halliburton, we think of, obviously Kyra Lewis is in there, but Killian Hayes is also another guy we might think of. How does his vision, accuracy, and feel for the game kind of compare to those guys? Is he in that same echelon as them, or is he in another tier?
As far as straight vision, LaMelo is in a class of his own, but I have my own issues, with his ability to actually run an offense. So it's not like that vision is, some worldly skill. Halliburton has probably better vision and better passing chops, but he also, isn't a great ball handler. So how much he'll be able to use his vision as a playmaker in the half court in the NBA remains to be seen. As great as I think he'll be in transition as a secondary playmaker, if you're looking at a primary playmaker, I don't know if I trust that part of his game. Killian is a guy that is probably the safest combination of both, where he has kind of like that LaMelo-like vision, although not as natural a feel, but also is a little bit more able to run an offense. So I think Killian, if you're putting the whole package together, is probably the top of that group. But I would put Kyra in that tier. To me, I have Kyra 5th on my big board overall in the entire draft. And one of the things with Kyra that I think has been overlooked is his passing in this draft. He is a legitimately good passer. There's one pass against Carolina that he made coming off the left wing where he live dribbled one hand left-handed through multiple defenders, whip pass to the weak side wing, which to me is probably one of my favorite passes of any prospect in the entire class this season. So he has that ability to make special reads. It maybe doesn't look as natural as some of these other guys, but I think that when you take into account the skill level that you need to succeed at the NBA level, and it can't just be, all right, my vision's great, like Halliburton needs the ball handling. LaMelo has that vision, but does he have the mentality to always make, very good decisions? And I think Kyra is in that upper echelon. While it might not be the thing that jumps out at you, I do think he's underrated. I'd probably put his vision 4th in that group, but I think, like I said, when you add in the fact that he can kind of do a little bit of everything that I mentioned that some of these guys have a weakness with, he is right there, and it wouldn't shock me if, he ended up being a better playmaker than some of the guys that we named.
Definitely, and I think you're completely justified. I've written about all those other guys. Like LaMelo Ball, for me, his decision-making is the biggest question mark. We know that he has the vision. We know he can make some pretty spectacular passes, but it's decision-making, and not just as a passer, but as a shooter. His shot selection is iffy. And I think on the other end too, there's some definite concerns of whether he's going to stand up as an NBA defender. I'm not really that convinced that he's going to be even average in that area. And then in terms of Halliburton, he is somebody who I really like as like this secondary, tertiary playmaker off of somebody who is handling the ball much more often. I think he plays much better in that role. And, I also kind of tend to agree with you with Kyra Lewis. I think he has the potential. I don't know if he's going to reach it, that he's going to get there, but I think that we've seen enough to say that there is some potential for him to be that primary ball handler at the next level. And that kind of brings me to my next question. So is he someone, and I know you said that, you think he's going to be a starter level, but do you think he's going to be somebody who can come into the NBA right away, play significant minutes for a team without hurting that team, if that makes sense?
Well, I don't think there's many players in the draft that are going to come in and not hurt their team. It's on the surrounding pieces. Typically, even the really good rookies actually suck. Their first year in the league, there's an adjustment to the speed of the game, the physicality. And then when you add into the fact that all of these guys are coming off such a long layoff, and when they jump in, they're jumping into the NBA where, a lot of these teams, half of the teams went into a bubble and, actually got some reps in not that long ago. So when you take into account all of the weird circumstances of the draft, I don't think many of these guys are going to be good right away. And I think that's why it's going to be important for us to kind of use patience, because it is such a weird year. Then you look at, they're talking about doing regional games for the season, and it's going to be more series. So, if you're doing a back-to-back against a certain team, they're going to have extra time to game plan for your weaknesses. So it's not going to be your typical year where a rookie might come in and catch guys off guard, because if in that first game they go off, well, guess what? You're playing a back-to-back against a team. That second game, now you're on the game plan and things might look a little different. So yeah, it's going to be weird. I don't necessarily think he's going to be a plus, but depending on the team that he goes to, like if he went to, I don't know, the Magic or something, who really need, kind of that playmaker, one guard, Fultz, he can play the two, you play the one. We don't really know what we get out of him. Maybe a spot like that where he is surrounded by some pretty decent vets, some guys who could defend and whatnot. I don't know. That could be a good spot for him. It all depends on where he goes. In San Antonio, look, he's playing for one of the best coaching staffs to ever sit on or stand on a sideline, and it wouldn't hurt to have Pop and even Chip England work with this kid. That doesn't hurt. So and Becky Hammond, it's just a great staff. So I think that as the season went on and you push past that rookie wall, I think he's a guy that you would look at and say, and you really start seeing that potential, even if it's not like leading to victories.
Sure, and I think the transition period is going to be even harder. I mean, you're right. They've had such a long layoff, but now that we know that the NBA is starting in late December, I mean, we're not going to get a summer league. We don't know how long a preseason is going to be. This season is going to be shortened, I believe, by 10 games, so that's fewer games to adjust. I think there is going to be a huge learning curve for almost every rookie that's coming into the NBA, but I thought it was a question worth, asking what your opinion was on that. And, I'd be excited if he joined the team. I'd be excited to see him play anywhere. I think that he's going to be a really exciting prospect. So we'll move into the next question. So do you think he has the potential to be this engine that makes an NBA offense run, or do you think he's more suited to like a secondary, tertiary initiator type role?
I do think he has the potential to make an offense run. I think, I still to this day don't understand why he hasn't been consistently talked about as a top 10, player in the lottery. The first time I watched him, he jumped off the screen to me as, NBA player. Because when you watch some really good college players, you can go, okay, but he's going to be he's a good college player, but will he be a good pro? To me, there are some guys that you just watch and you say, this is not the right league for him. And Kyra is the type of kid who will thrive with a more open floor surrounded by shooters and a fast pace. So for me, I'm so high on his potential. The one thing that, may hold him back, even though I do think that he really got better at it, is that, he's kind of, he was okay at Team USA, kind of fitting in. He didn't necessarily want to take over, and you can either look at that as he was kind of just playing a role, and he was fine being a team player in a international setting, or you could look at it as, do you want that kind of personality in your point guard? He clearly took the reins, in year 2 at Bama. So I personally am high on him and believe that he will be a really high level player. And it just comes down to, like you're going up against Steph Curry and Kyrie Irving and Westbrook and, all the other high level all NBA point guards that are in the league. It's, can he get to that kind of tier, which I don't think he'll get to that tier, but I do think he can make an NBA offense go. So not going to be your first option, but is going to be an effective, lead guard, given the right team, for sure.
Sure, and I think we kind of, and I hate to keep coming back to Tony Parker, but we saw it with Tony Parker where he was never the best player on the Spurs, never necessarily their first option, maybe for a year or two when they were in transition between, Duncan being their best player to Parker, but he was never really considered like that top 1, 2, 3 point guard in the league. He had a couple of top 10 MVP finishes, but nobody was ever going to make him the MVP of the league. And I think that's important to remember, that you don't have to be the best player on your team or necessarily an MVP candidate to be that lead guard kind of guy. And if that's what you think with Kyra Lewis, I think that's a fair point to make for sure. And I think one of my other questions I have for you is, I talked about it with you a second ago. where it's like DeJounte, Lonnie, with pretty much all the young guys on the Spurs, with the exception of Keldon Johnson, are kind of iffy finishers at the rim. Where is he as a finisher? And, we know where his free throw rate is, but, what else does his scoring repertoire kind of consist of?
So he was like a pretty good finisher in college. He wasn't elite, but he wasn't bad. He was right there in the middle, like probably a little bit above league average. Partly, you think maybe because he's trying to avoid some contact, so some of the finishes he's making harder on himself because he doesn't want to, go into somebody's body. Maybe the added weight that he's put on, hopefully that's the kind of thing that you expect him to fix up. But he did have some really nice finishes, mid-air, switching hands, left hand, showed some nice touch around the hoop on multiple instances that lead me to believe that it's an area that he will improve on. I don't think that he'll have Kyrie's touch. I don't think that he's going to use, the strength of a guy like Eric Bledsoe to power through people at the rim from the position. But I think that as long as he is just, a little bit better than average with the amount of pressure that he puts on a defense that, you kind of know that you have to guard him all the way to the hoop, he is going to be able to use that to his advantage to stop and make, get to his footer, to hit shooters when the defense helps out and closes too far. So, I think his finishing definitely needs some improvement, and I think that's true with a lot of young guards. Especially, I know he's a sophomore, but he's younger than Cole Anthony by like a lot. So he's a young player who's still learning the game and learning how to use angles and whatnot. But, I think that his touch around the hoop is solid enough that, he's going to show some positive signs, especially when it gets to his right hand. His left hand is really where, you want to see the improvements. And I think, you're looking in year one just to see the potential of the finishing. You don't necessarily need to see him be one of the top finishers, at his position in year one. You want to see just that the potential's there. Can he get to the hoop? Does he show some, the potential to have nice touch at the big leagues? And by year two, hopefully you figure that he improves on, the things that he's improving on as his rookie season goes along.
Sure, and I don't think it's like the end all be all for needing to be like this amazing finisher in year one, because I looked at Ja Morant and his finishing numbers. He was just slightly better than DeJounte was at finishing within 5 feet of the rim this year, and that was pretty bad. And we still saw him have a pretty spectacular rookie season. And another thing I think that was really awesome that you bring up is that he is so young. He was 17 turning 18 as a freshman, 18 turning 19 as a sophomore. He might as well have been a freshman. And we saw pretty tremendous growth from year one to year two. And I think that experience at the college level, those 2 years of experience, are going to help him going into the next league, because we see a lot of these guys coming one and done, and it's a huge transition for them. And he's had some more time to kind of groom his game, work some kinks out of it. So I'm pretty confident that he'll be able to, shore up some areas that he's not so great in. And the other question I asked you was, what do you think of his scoring repertoire? What exactly does it consist of? Is he, someone who can shoot off the dribble? Is he a good shooter? Is he a good 3-point shooter? Is he more of a catch and shoot guy? Or is he someone who you can run off screens, who's going to be a motion shooter? What do you think of him there?
Yeah, so he is a good shooter. And this is the thing that perplexes me about, his draft position on some of these mocks, which I don't think are indicative of where he actually ends up on draft night. But it's not like he can't shoot. It's not like he's fast and he can't shoot. Again, he's not RJ Hampton. He shot nearly 37% from three. And he's a guy who's doing it off the dribble. He's doing it, he's not just catching and shooting. He's not letting other guys create the offense and he's just waiting to take an open shot. He's doing it as the focus of the defense. You go under on him, he's going to hit a shot on you. You play him tight, he's going to hit his step back. He's going to get there, and he creates a lot of separation with his step back. And he uses that to get to the rim. If you can't go under because he'll hit the shot. And when you start chasing him over, he's got that speed to get that extra step on you off the screen. So as far as his offense, to me, again, it's crazy. He's going to be a good shooter. And especially the way he finished the season where he was, averaging, I think, over 23 points a game. To me, he's got the the bag that you want from an NBA point guard as far as that goes, because he doesn't need anybody to create offense for him, and he also doesn't need a screen. He can get to his shot without it, and yeah, I'm very high on his offensive potential in the NBA because, like I said, that shot creates so many advantages for him where he can get to his strengths, using his speed to do all the other things, get to his spots, get to his floater, get to the hoop, create for his teammates. So I'm a big fan of it.
Sure, and like no knock on Alabama. They were a pretty solid program last year, but he didn't have the greatest supporting cast. And I think that's another one of the things that I really thought stood out for me is his shooting numbers and his efficiency was really good considering who he had around him. So I think that's another reason that I just buy into Kira Lewis as a prospect. And, I guess one of the last things I want to ask you about is, as a defender, we've really talked about his game as like an offensive player, but where is he as a team defender, an individual defender? And what do you think his ceiling could be defensively in the NBA?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he's going to end up on an all defensive team at any point in his career. He's not going to be Pat Beverly. He's not going to be Gary Harris. He's not that kind of defender. Because he's going to carry some of the offensive load. If he only focused on defense, then maybe. Because I do think he has really great instincts. As a man defender individually, he's a guy, I think he's at the top of the draft for these prospects in block shots. And, at the point guard position or at the guard position in general, it's not like he's coming from the weak side and meeting guys at the rim and blocking shots. He's doing it, anticipating, beating guys to a spot, getting a hand in their face, using his length, to get a tip on the ball. So, when you think of him using his speed on defense, it's not like he's just fast on one side of the ball. He does have good anticipation. He does, know how to, ice a screen, get guys to go to their left hand. And defensively, you worry about being pushed around, his strength. But his technique and his instincts, I think, are excellent. And as a team defender, he's a guy that is going to get in the passing lanes off ball, but he doesn't cheat. He's not a guy who overhelps and over cheats just to get steals. So, while he may not lead the league in steals because he isn't always looking to cheat, he is a guy that's going to use those instincts, that speed to get in the passing lanes. And then he's just, he's going to be a guy who understands the concepts and it obviously, again, he's a rookie. He's not going to be immediately. Defense is not his calling card, but he is a guy that's smart enough to figure out the concepts, and eventually I project him to be, at the very least, an average defender who is able to create defense into offense. Getting in the passing lanes and whatnot.
Sure, and I think that would be a welcome sight for San Antonio. We saw a lot of Marco Bellinelli, a lot of Brent Forbes, pretty good shootings, but obviously very one-dimensional players. They don't really create for anybody else. They're not really, people are going to drive to the rim. They're not people who are even really going to create much offense for themselves. And obviously on the other end, we know how bad they were last season. So I think if he's just just average at best, that is easily an upgrade of what we saw last season for the Spurs. And we'll end on a Spurs-related question. So I'm not so sure how familiar you are with San Antonio's roster or the Spurs or how much you got to see of them. But if you put Kira Lewis up against the other guards who are on the team, would you take him over any of the other young guards that the Spurs have? So like DeJounte Murray, Derek White, Lonnie Walker, Keldon Johnson. If you want to throw Kendary Weatherspoon in there, you can. But would you take him over any of those guys or is he someone who kind of ranks somewhere in the middle?
No, I would take him over all of them, honestly. Like I said, he's the 5th prospect on my big board overall in this draft. And while I absolutely love DeJounte Murray, and hopefully, given the fact that, we haven't had this extended time off, he was coming off the injury last year. Hopefully that is done with and he is just going to be back athletically fully to the player he is when he comes back. I did think that we'd see more strides in his shot last year than we did, and functionally his form kind of looks fine to me. So, maybe it just comes down to him getting the confidence to make some of the tough shots. And I think he's a phenomenal defender. So, with pretty decent size. So I actually think that he and Kira could probably play in the same backcourt together, which I think would be a really interesting dynamic. But I would take Kira above all those guys. And I like Lonnie Walker. Obviously, he's incredibly athletic. He could shoot the ball. But he does seem to me a little bit to be that, kind of can't fully drive the car yet. Like it goes fast, but when it gets too fast, he starts wobbling a little bit. And I don't know if he's going to ever be able to control the car. I don't know if the speed that he's built to play at is meant to slow down. So I think Kyra is the guy that has that speed, but can control it. Just because, he can push it to 115 doesn't mean that he's going to. Sometimes he's going to drive the speed limit. And I think offensively, he kind of has, a combination of, all of the Spurs guard's strengths. Like I said, he can pass it, he can shoot it, and he does have that blazing speed and is able to use his athleticism. Even if there's not like much vertical pop like some of the other Spurs guards, the speed in and of itself is impressive enough. So I would take him above all of the Spurs guards. Look, the Spurs have the 11th pick in the draft. If he makes it to the 11th pick, I think a lot of NBA GMs are going to regret it. I've said for a while, I think he's the guy that if he gets out of the top 10, out of the lottery, we look back and say, man, why were we so foolish with this kid? Because to me, all the signs are there. If the Spurs can get him at 11, I think run to the podium and take him. And I think that he would just be any of the teams in this range. He's, to me, his floor should be New York at 8. That's to me where his floor should be. Obviously some of the teams like Cleveland has a bunch of guards. It would be hard to see them taking him. Atlanta, you have Trey. There's not. I don't know how well they fit in the backcourt, but like Detroit, New York, either one of those teams should very heavily consider Kyra there. So if he makes it to the Spurs, I think that would be really a godsend for them.
Yeah, and I almost completely agree with you there. For me, it's like I don't really expect him to fall that low. I think he's too good, and I think NBA front offices are not dumb enough to let him fall that low because even the worst front offices have like good basketball people in it. So I'm hoping, and it may just be like wishful thinking, but I'm hoping that enough people are smart enough to recognize that this guy is, and to me, like a mid to early level lottery talent. I don't think he will be there for the Spurs. If he is, I would also take him. I'm not really very huge on this idea of drafting for positional need when you don't have somebody who can run your team. And I think the Spurs are kind of ready to move on from LaMarcus, ready to move on from DeMar, whether that's this year or next year. Drafting a forward with lower ceiling, maybe a higher floor, to me doesn't make a lot of sense at 11. I know a lot of Spurs fans are very heavy on this Precious Achiuwa, Saddiq Bey bandwagon at 11. I think those would be an underwhelming pick with Saddiq Bey. I think that's a very safe pick. And then with Precious Achiuwa, for me, on my big board, he's actually a second rounder. I'm really not very high on him. I think he has a lot of athletic tools. I think he's solid as a defender because of those athletic tools. I don't think he has great feel for the game really on either end of the floor. I want to see more out of him. And he's not that he's old, but he's not as young as I think a lot of Spurs fans think he is. And I'm not really like that big on a forward who's not going to be able to play make, who's not a great shooter. And I think he may be good in a system like the Spurs system. Like if he was available in the second round, for sure. Later in the first round, they traded down for sure. Maybe that would be someone they would pick. But to me, it's both of those guys I would not go after. But in terms of, all the Spurs guards that we listed, Kira Lewis ranking there. For me, he ranks above everybody but Derek White. And I'm very pro Derek White. I'm huge on Derek White. He was one of the most efficient pick and roll ball handlers in the league this season. We saw him shoot about 40-ish% on about 8 attempts in the bubble before he went down with that injury. Is that sustainable? I'm not so sure, but it was a good sign to see that from him. And then he also led the league in blocks by a guard, and he's very disciplined as a defender. I thought he kind of got snubbed for at least a few all-defensive team votes. Not necessarily that he needed to be on an all-defensive team, but that he should have gotten more votes than someone like Luka Doncic. I mean, that was kind of ridiculous to me. But I think he's somebody who could be a really solid player, and I'd love to see Kyra and Derek White work out because I think they're just such contrasting styles. Or one guy's like 100 miles per hour, but also controlled. But you got someone like Derek who's a little bit slower, more methodical, very patient player. So I'd love to see that. And in terms of DeJounte, I love him so much, but I feel like I haven't seen enough from him. And I try to give him a break because it's like he had that pretty devastating ACL injury. He was out a year. He's coming back. He was on a minutes restriction. Then he was flip-flopping in the rotation with Derek. Never really got to play with him, just kind of trading off minutes. So I don't know how I can like properly evaluate him, but I wanted to see more. I like that he was someone who was, I think, top 4 in field goal percentage for players who were high volume, just being defined as at least 4 attempts per game mid-range shooters. I like that. I like that he shot about 37% from 3 on catch and shoot, but it was such a low volume that I don't know if I'm ready to buy into him as like a catch and shoot, standstill shooter guy. And he's definitely not a motion shooter. He's not someone who's running off screens. And I don't think he has the greatest vision as a point guard. He's labeled as a point guard, but is he really a point guard? I don't know. So I think all of those guys, even just pure guard, as pure just guard, I would probably take Kyra second, and then everybody else can follow behind him. But again, he's somebody who I think the Spurs, if he's there, you can't pass up on him. I think that's just too great of a value.
Yeah, I want to shout out Derek White because he is very underappreciated because his game isn't as sexy as some of the other guys. And I think what you said about Precious is interesting. And the whole time I was thinking I have him a little bit higher because I do think while he is out of control a lot of the times, I do think he does bring a lot of like pretty interesting tools in a draft that if you are going to take like a chance on one of the like kind of toolsy like just question mark guys, I think he's one of the guys that you should take a chance on. But he is kind of like a little bit taller version of Lonnie, in kind of a way. Like he's kind of like the big man version of Lonnie Walker a little bit, to where he has all the raw stuff that you absolutely dream of, the big body, the athletic ability. He shows flashes of all the tools, but he sometimes just can't stop himself from going too fast. It's almost like they're, I don't know if I'm dating myself with the Mighty Ducks, but they're almost like Luis Mendoza, where he goes too fast and then he doesn't know how to stop. So yeah, that's all I kept thinking about. I don't know how at Pop's age if he could deal with 2 guys like that at the same time, but man, that would be interesting to watch for sure.
Yeah, and I'm not really sure that, I really don't think the Spurs would take him at 11. I know that they've talked to him, and I know that he said he'd love to run like how the Spurs were running an offense where it was a lot of motion offense, a lot of run and gun, just run and transition in the bubble. I'm just not so sure how well he like fits into that. I don't know. To me, he's not somebody who comes into the league and is an immediate contributor. I don't think in a meaningful way. And for Spurs fans, I hear a lot of them saying, well, he's like this can't miss guy. I really want him at 11. I want him in that lineup. We need to fill a hole at forward. But again, I just am not huge on filling a positional need if there's somebody better available and you don't have that guy who is the superstar running the show. And I think we've seen other teams kind of take that philosophy, like with Boston. They were heavy on guards. They were heavy on assets with no real like serious direction. And then they got a big break. They've got Jaylen Brown. They've got Jason Tatum, and they can build around that. And I think that's a better strategy. And you're able to use those assets to get picks or get other players. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that philosophy. Maybe yours is a little bit different.
Yeah, I think, obviously Boston did a phenomenal job of getting that top end talent, in their draft spot. It's a little harder in the Spurs position, just because of where they're drafting. But if, certain guys fall, I think Patrick Williams is a guy at that spot who would kind of fit that mold where, like Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, they are those big wings who you could picture on the floor in a playoff game because they're switchable and, they're kind of versatile on offense. Obviously Jason Tatum in the fact that he could run it, but Jaylen Brown, he can get a bucket when he wants, but he could also kind of play off and not, he doesn't need the ball in his hand. So, if you can get a guy like that at the Spurs position and kind of follow their model, obviously that makes a ton of sense. And whether that's at the guard spot with, a guy like Kyra or like, from the wings with Pat Williams, obviously the Celtics are the model, but obviously, they're also having trouble finding guard depth themselves beyond, Kemba Walker. So it's easier said than done when you're not drafting in the top, 5, which is where they got their things. But like you said, you got to make use of your assets. So I think one of the things that, teams have to do is you can't fall in love with your own assets. And, you mentioned a bunch of the Spurs guards, and I like all of them in some capacity. I skipped over Keldon Johnson, who I thought, was pretty good for rookie, and kind of, if he was not in San Antonio, I think he probably would have got a little bit more buzz as a player. But I think you can't fall in love with those guys, and if you have a chance to use them to upgrade the spot or to a different position or whatever, that's important too, because like just naming those 4 guys, you take Kyra and add him into the mix, sometimes it almost does a disservice. Obviously fit is not the way that you want to go in a draft all the time necessarily, but it is something you do have to consider in some capacity, because you need to be able to give these players a chance to grow into a role and see what they're capable of. When you start overloading on guards, sometimes it gets a little iffy, especially when there's crossover in skills. But yeah, if you can follow the Celtics model and it can't hurt.
Sure. And I think that is important to remember. Yes, like the San Antonio Spurs have a ton of guards, and I think that is something that's really important to remember. What you said is like, don't fall in love with your assets. Just because you drafted Kyra Lewis does not mean you need to now keep every single guy who is also a guard. And I know they just extended DeJounte, and I'm not necessarily advocating for them to trade him by any means. But if, a team comes knocking and has an interesting deal, don't just hang on to him because you gave him that extension. I think Kyra Lewis has way more potential than DeJounte does at this part of his career. And also the fact that DeJounte has had some pretty serious injuries there, I think that's also a little worrisome for me. Is he ever going to gain that 100% of that burst back? Is he ever going to finish well at the rim? Where is he going to be as a distributor? I still think that's probably his most limited skill as a point guard. And then I want to go back to Precious real quick. Like, I know I've knocked on him, but he's still a good player. I think he's a good value for a team who may be willing to be more patient with him. And with the Spurs, I like someone like Pat Will more than I do Precious Achiuwa. And I think for them, that's actually, to me, the most realistic guy that will be available at 11. I know there's been a little bit of buzz about him moving up, but I think he's probably going to fall to the Spurs. And the Spurs, he does fit a positional need of some sort. He is the second youngest prospect in the draft. I think he has quite a bit of upside as a switchable defender on the other end, and someone who has a little bit of potential to be kind of like a secondary or tertiary distributor as a forward, like a big wing almost. So I like him at 11. He's not my top guy at 11, but if he's there and the Spurs take him, I would by no means be upset about that at all. I think there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of valuable players in this class. And just because you're not going to get a star, that doesn't mean it isn't a good draft, especially at 11. I think the best you can hope for, and I did a whole examination of every 11th pick ever. Most of them are just functional role players, and that's fine at 11, because you also have another group of guys who are busts, and a very small, tiny group there, like the Reggie Miller, who was the one guy who's an NBA Hall of Famer. Maybe you got Kiki Vanderway, who's a pretty good player in his own right, but that's just unlikely. That's probably not what you're going to get at 11 in this class. Maybe so, but I just don't think that's the case. But this, that we've kind of wrapped things up. So I appreciate you coming on here. This is kind of your time to shine. What are you working on? Where can people find you? What is your @ go for it.
Yeah. So my @ is @Hardwood Herald. I post all the time on Twitter. You could find me, @Hardwood Herald on pretty much everything, even TikTok. But the one thing that I'll plug, I just released a NBA draft magazine. It's called The Hardwood. The magazine itself is probably not going to focus on the draft for every issue that we put out, but this, drop in particular is pretty much completely focused on the draft. The physical copies actually sold out. I released them about 4 days ago, so I'm actually, kind of, at a loss for words at how fast they went, but you can also get a PDF download as well. So you could either find it by going to my website, hardwoodherald.com, or there's a link to the pinned tweet in my Twitter account. So you can find that in either spot. And, it's got my big board, which, everyone loves a big board. It's one of the biggest questions I get about my draft opinions, who's on your board, what's the order, whatnot. But besides that, I wrote a couple of articles for it, but I also have a bunch of really talented writers who wrote stuff for it. Matt Brooks, Josh Jeffries, Mavs Draft on Twitter. There's so many guys who did a phenomenal job. I interviewed Rashad Phillips, who, probably a pretty controversial guy on Twitter, but we had a really great sit down. You can actually watch a video as well if on my YouTube, which is where you'll find all of my draft breakdown. So that's really the bread and butter of, if you really want to get in depth. I've done, I think, over 20 prospects in the draft of, really in depth film room style stuff. You know, I coach basketball. I've coached for almost 10 years, so I you know, it's kind of my bread and butter. But I talk about the prospects in a way that I'm not going to bore you or make you feel like you're sitting through like a math class or a science class. You know, I speak to you in the way that if we were just talking hoops as friends, you know, that's how I speak to you, because sometimes, you know, basketball's simple and it doesn't always have to be overcomplicated with all these fancy words and plays and sets and whatever. So yeah, that's where you'll find all the breakdowns. That's where you'll find the Kyra Lewis breakdown and breakdowns on some of the other guys we talked about, like Pat Will. So just search Hardwood Herald and you can go to the playlist and hit the 2020 draft, and you could spend just days there at this point, because, you know, each breakdown's anywhere from like 10 to 15 minutes long on the players.
And Spurs fans, definitely check out that YouTube content. Check out all of his content, but especially that YouTube content. I can verify that. I went on there, I looked at the video, I was like, oh, this is 10 minutes long. I'll give it a watch. And then I ended up watching another and another. And before I knew it, like 40 minutes had gone by. Not only, and I said this to you earlier, but not only do they inform you, they're incredibly informative, but they look great, they sound great. You clearly know what you're talking about. And I think for a casual fan, or even somebody who is really like hardcore draft fan kind of, you know, NBA person, you're going to love the content regardless. So thank you again for coming out and talking to me. And thank you, Spurs fans, for tuning into this. As always, don't forget to like, subscribe, you know, hit that notification button if you want to know when the next video is dropping. Leave me a comment. Well, who do you want to see? You know, what do we want to cover in the future? What can I do better? But until next time, everybody take care.